On August 4, 1996, Rashad Staggie stepped out of his SUV in front of his own house on London Road in Salt River, Cape Town. He was facing roughly 3,000 people who had marched there specifically to find him. Within minutes, he would be shot, set on fire with a petrol bomb, and then shot again while burning. The entire sequence was filmed by television crews and photographers who had followed the crowd to his doorstep. What makes this moment unusual is not just the violence, but the fact that Rashad Staggie was one half of the twin leadership of the Hard Livings Gang, an organization with 6,000 members and international connections to the Sicilian Mafia, Chinese triads, and Nigerian networks. He had built a reputation as untouchable. The crowd that killed him was not a rival gang. It was a coalition of teachers, community activists, and ordinary residents who had spent months organizing public marches against drug dealers. They called themselves People Against Gangsterism and Drugs. By the time they reached London Road, they had stopped being a protest movement and become something else entirely. The Hard Livings Gang did not emerge from a vacuum. It was built on the rubble of forced removals that reshaped Cape Town during apartheid. The Group Areas Act of 1950 gave the state legal authority to separate the city by race, and over the following 2 decades, the government removed more than 1 million people classified as colored or black from established neighborhoods. District 6, Lower Claremont, and Simon's Town were dismantled street by street. Families who had lived in the same areas for generations were relocated to the Cape Flats, a stretch of sandy, undeveloped land on the outskirts of the city. The removals were not random. They were calculated acts of spatial engineering designed to fragment communities that had developed their own social structures over decades. In District 6 alone, over 60,000 people were forcibly moved between 1968 and 1982. The government demolished their homes and replaced them with facilities for white residents or simply left the land vacant as a buffer zone. The Cape Flats had no infrastructure, no job opportunities, and no social institutions to replace the ones that had been destroyed. What it did have was overcrowding and extreme poverty. The townships built on the flats were designed for maximum density with minimum investment. Houses were small, services were inadequate, and unemployment was endemic. The schools that existed were overcrowded and underfunded. Hospitals were few and far between. The police presence was either minimal or openly hostile to residents. What the state created was not a neighborhood but a dumping ground. Before the removals, the street gangs known as Scollies were small groups that operated within a larger community structure. Neighbors knew them, and informal social controls kept their activities in check. Older residents could intervene when younger men stepped out of line. Churches, social clubs, and extended family networks provided alternative paths to status and belonging. When those communities were broken apart and dumped onto the Cape Flats, the Scollies lost their context. They evolved into something more organized and more territorial. The Cape Flats became a breeding ground for criminal syndicates because the state had created the conditions for them. Without legitimate economic opportunities, crime became a rational survival strategy. Without established social networks, gangs became the primary source of identity and protection. The transformation from Scollie to syndicate was not a moral failing. It was an adaptive response to structural violence. Rashid and Rashad Staggie were born in 1961 in Mooirivier, a suburb that was also subject to forced removal. Their family was moved to Mainenberg, a township that would later become the operational center of the Hard Livings Gang. Mainenberg was established in 1966 as part of the apartheid government's plan to relocate colored families from inner-city Cape Town. The township was built quickly and cheaply, with row after row of identical houses packed tightly together. There were few communal spaces, few businesses, and few reasons for anyone with options to stay. Growing up in Mainenberg meant growing up in an environment where survival required adaptability. The twins turned to petty crime as teenagers, then transitioned into drug dealing. The path from petty theft to organized crime was not a dramatic leap. It was a series of small, rational decisions made in the absence of legal economic opportunities. By 1971, when Rashid and Rashad were 10 years old, they had already begun forming the core of what would become the Hard Livings. The gang was officially founded that year, though it would take another 2 decades before it reached its full scale. In the early years, the Hard Livings was just one of many small street groups operating in Mainenberg and the surrounding townships. What set it apart was the twins' willingness to centralize authority and their understanding that scale mattered. A gang that controlled multiple neighborhoods could negotiate better terms with suppliers, protect its territory more effectively, and offer more attractive incentives to potential recruits. The Hard Livings distinguished itself from other Cape Flats gangs through centralization. Most gangs in the area operated as loose confederations of neighborhood cliques. Leadership was fluid, alliances were temporary, and territorial control was constantly contested. The Staggie twins built a hierarchy. They established clear lines of authority, standardized initiation rituals, and created a command structure that could survive the imprisonment or death of individual members. This organizational sophistication allowed the hard livings to expand beyond Mainenberg into neighboring townships and eventually across the Western Cape. They adopted the British Union Jack as their symbol, a deliberate contrast to their primary rivals, a gang called the Americans who used the American flag. The hard livings called themselves the Chosen Ones. This was not just branding. It was part of a deliberate strategy to create a sense of identity and belonging for young men who had no clear path to social status. The symbolism mattered because it provided a framework for understanding gang membership as something more than criminal activity. It transformed participation into a form of identity politics, where the Union Jack represented not Britain but a distinct Cape Flats identity that rejected both the apartheid state and American cultural imperialism. On the Cape Flats, traditional rites of passage into manhood had been disrupted by poverty and displacement. In many African cultures, young men undergo specific rituals that mark their transition from boyhood to adulthood. These rituals provide structure, community recognition, and a clear sense of purpose. The forced removals and economic marginalization of the Cape Flats destroyed many of these traditional practices. Families were scattered, elders lost authority, and community cohesion dissolved. The gang provided an alternative structure. Police attention, arrests, and prison time were reframed as rites of passage. The state became the enemy, and surviving encounters with the state became a source of admiration within the gang. For boys facing what one researcher called an abyss of danger, the hard livings offered structure, purpose, and the promise of respect. The initiation process into the hard livings was rigorous. Prospective members were required to prove their loyalty through increasingly serious criminal acts. Minor theft might be followed by assault, then armed robbery, and eventually participation in turf wars against rival gangs. Each escalation served as a test of commitment and a demonstration of competence. Those who completed the process became full members with access to the gang's resources and protection. Those who failed or refused were cast out and often became targets themselves. The system created a strong in-group identity and made defection extremely costly. The Staggy twins cultivated a public image that blended fear with paternalism. They were known to drive through poor neighborhoods in expensive cars, throwing 10 Rand notes out the windows to schoolchildren. This tactic was not generosity. It was a calculated effort to position themselves as role models and protectors. If the community saw them as benefactors, it became much harder for law enforcement to find witnesses or informants. The twins understood that sustainable criminal power requires some degree of community consent or at least community silence. The money they distributed was a small fraction of their revenue, but it bought them significant goodwill. The twins were compared to the Cray brothers of the United Kingdom, and they seemed to embrace the comparison. Ronnie and Reggie Cray had built a criminal empire in East London during the 1950s and 1960s through a combination of violence, charisma, and strategic public relations. They cultivated relationships with celebrities, donated to local charities, and presented themselves as community figures rather than mere criminals. The Staggy twins adopted a similar playbook. They attended community events, funded local sports teams, and made sure that their presence in the townships was visible and to some extent welcome. They projected untouchability not just through violence but through the perception that they were integral to the community's functioning. By the 1990s, the hard livings had evolved into an international operation. The gang maintained relationships with the 28s, a powerful prison gang that served as a bridge between street operations and the correctional system. The 28s are part of the Numbers gangs, a prison gang system that originated in South African prisons in the early 20th century. The system is divided into the 26s, 27s, and 28s, each with distinct roles and hierarchies. The 28s are traditionally focused on maintaining order through violence and sexual dominance within prisons. For the hard livings, the alliance with the 28s meant continuity. Members could be arrested, serve time, and re-enter the organization without losing status. The prison system, rather than disrupting gang operations, became an extension of them. The gang's international connections allowed it to access large shipments of drugs and firearms that smaller, fragmented gangs could not obtain. The relationship with the Sicilian mafia provided access to European drug markets and smuggling routes. The connection with Chinese triads opened channels for precursor chemicals needed to manufacture synthetic drugs. The Nigerian networks facilitated the movement of money and contraband across African borders. These relationships were not formalized treaties but flexible arrangements based on mutual benefit. The hard livings provided distribution networks within South Africa, and their international partners provided product and expertise. The expansion of the hard livings was directly tied to the rise of Mandrax in South Africa. Mandrax is the brand name for methaqualone, a sedative that was originally developed as a legal pharmaceutical in the 1950s. It was marketed as a safe alternative to barbiturates for treating insomnia and anxiety. By the 1960s, it had become clear that methaqualone was highly addictive and prone to abuse. In the 1970s, it became a popular recreational drug in multiple countries, including South Africa. On the Cape Flats, mandrax was typically smoked in combination with cannabis, a mixture known as a white pipe. The pipe itself was improvised from a broken glass bottleneck, usually from a Coca-Cola or beer bottle. Users would place a mixture of crushed mandrax tablets and cannabis in the bottleneck, heat it, and inhale the smoke. The method allowed for rapid onset of effects, producing a powerful sedative high. When mandrax was banned in the late 1970s, its illegal importation and manufacture became the most lucrative illicit industry in Cape Town. The ban did not reduce demand. It simply shifted production and distribution into criminal hands. The Staggy twins capitalized on this market. They transformed the hard livings from a street gang into a structured criminal organization capable of handling international drug shipments. The ability to secure large consignments distinguished them from competitors. While smaller gangs might deal in grams or ounces, the hard livings dealt in kilograms and eventually tons. Mandrax was not just a source of revenue. It also functioned as a tool of social control. Evidence from Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings suggest that the apartheid state may have allowed or even encouraged the distribution of narcotics as a form of pacification. The logic was straightforward. A population addicted to drugs is less likely to organize politically. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, as anti-apartheid resistance intensified, large quantities of mandrax and MDMA reportedly went missing from law enforcement seizures and reappeared on the streets. Some of this was allegedly used to fund political movements on both sides of the conflict, but it also served to keep high-conflict areas chemically subdued. Whether this was deliberate policy or opportunistic corruption remains debated, but the effect was the same. The Cape Flats, which should have been a hotbed of political resistance, remained relatively quiet during the final years of apartheid. For the hard livings, the mandrax trade provided what one researcher called the power to pay. This was not just about personal enrichment. It was about creating a system of economic dependency that extended throughout the community. Residents would store parcels of drugs or weapons for the gang in exchange for financial support. A family facing eviction might receive rent money. A mother struggling to feed her children might receive groceries. A young man looking for work might receive a small loan. Each transaction created a debt, not necessarily financial but social and moral. People who accepted help from the hard livings were less likely to cooperate with police investigations. This created a buffer against police intervention. If everyone in a neighborhood is economically dependent on the gang, the likelihood of finding witnesses drops to nearly zero. The dynamic created what sociologists call a deprivation trap. The poor were simultaneously exploited by the gang and dependent on it for resources that the formal state failed to provide. The South African government, even after the transition to democracy, struggled to deliver basic services to the Cape Flats. Schools remained overcrowded, clinics were understaffed, and social welfare programs were inadequate. In this vacuum, the hard livings became a shadow government. They provided employment through the drug trade, protection through violence, and financial assistance through their criminal profits. For many residents, the gang was more responsive and more reliable than the state. By the mid-1990s, mandrax production had shifted from importation to domestic manufacture. Seizures of anthranilic acid, a key precursor chemical used to synthesize methaqualone, began to increase, indicating that clandestine labs were operating inside South Africa. This shift was significant because it meant the hard livings and other gangs were no longer dependent on international suppliers. They could produce their own product, control quality, and maximize profits. The white pipe remained the dominant consumption method, and the drug's prevalence on the Cape Flats showed no signs of declining. For the hard livings, this meant a stable and expanding revenue base. For the community, it meant ongoing addiction and violence. Cannabis, the other component of the white pipe, was locally produced in the Eastern Cape and transported to Cape Town in bulk. The combination of locally sourced cannabis and domestically manufactured mandrax created a completely South African supply chain. This vertical integration made the hard livings less vulnerable to international law enforcement efforts and allowed them to operate with greater autonomy. The economic power this generated was substantial. At its peak, the hard livings was estimated to control a significant percentage of the Cape Town drug market, generating millions of rands in revenue annually. The white pipe had a specific cultural significance on the Cape Flats beyond its chemical effects. Smoking the white pipe was a social activity, often done in groups in specific locations known as smoking spots. These spots became gathering places where information was exchanged, relationships were formed, and gang business was conducted. The ritual of preparing and smoking the pipe, breaking the bottle, crushing the tablets, mixing with cannabis created a shared experience that reinforced social bonds. For many young men, participation in white pipe culture was an entry point into gang life, a way of demonstrating belonging before formal initiation. The transition to constitutional democracy in 1994 did not bring the reduction in crime that many South Africans had expected. If anything, the liberalization of society and the relaxation of border controls led to an influx of international criminal networks. The end of apartheid meant the end of many repressive security measures, including tight border controls and extensive police surveillance of townships. While these measures had been tools of oppression, they had also inadvertently constrained certain types of criminal activity. When they were lifted, South Africa became an attractive destination for international drug cartels, arms dealers, and human traffickers. The Cape Flats remained plagued by gang violence. The hard livings and the Americans were engaged in a deadly turf war that left bodies in the streets on a regular basis. The violence was not random, it was strategic. Control of territory meant control of drug distribution networks, which meant revenue. Every street corner was contested space. Shootings occurred in broad daylight, often in residential areas where children were playing. Funerals became flashpoints for further violence as rival gangs used them as opportunities for retaliation. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Each killing demanded revenge, which provoked further retaliation, which required another response. The police were either unable or unwilling to intervene effectively. Community leaders began to suspect that some officers were complicit with gang leaders, either through corruption or through a simple unwillingness to confront well-armed criminal organizations. Corruption within the South African police service was not limited to a few bad actors. It was systemic. Officers on the Cape Flats faced dangerous working conditions, low pay, and minimal support from their superiors. Some took bribes simply to supplement their income. Others developed relationships with gang members that blurred the line between law enforcement and collaboration. Still others were intimidated into inaction by threats against themselves or their families. The result was a police force that the community did not trust and that gang leaders did not fear. Frustration with the state's failure to protect its citizens led to the formation of People Against Gangsterism and Drugs in December 1995. PAGAD was initially a multi-religious coalition. Its membership included Muslims, Christians, teachers, and ordinary citizens who had no prior involvement in activism. The founding meeting was held at a mosque in Cape Town, and the initial organizers were primarily Muslim community leaders who had watched their neighborhoods deteriorate under gang control. The group's early tactics were nonviolent. They organized public demonstrations and ultimatum marches to the homes of known drug dealers, demanding that they stop their activities or face unspecified consequences. The marches were theatrical and confrontational. Hundreds of people would gather outside a dealer's house, chanting slogans and demanding that he come out and renounce his activities. The goal was to shame drug dealers into compliance and to demonstrate to the community that resistance was possible. PAGAD's rhetoric was framed in religious and moral terms. The dominant membership was Muslim, and the group drew heavily on Islamic scripture and symbolism. Leaders framed the fight against drugs and gangs as a form of jihad, a struggle against moral corruption. They invoked Quranic verses condemning intoxicants and calling for justice. This religious framing served multiple purposes. It provided moral legitimacy, mobilized a committed base of supporters, and differentiated PAGAD from secular political movements that had failed to address gang violence. The group's slogan, "One merchant, one bullet," reflected a growing impatience with legal processes and a willingness to contemplate extrajudicial action. They called for the reintroduction of the death penalty for drug dealers, a demand that the post-apartheid government was unwilling to meet. South Africa's new constitution, adopted in 1996, explicitly prohibited capital punishment. The Constitutional Court had ruled the death penalty unconstitutional in 1995, arguing that it violated the right to life and dignity enshrined in the Bill of Rights. For PAGAD's leadership, this decision represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the crisis facing the Cape Flats. They argued that drug dealers were destroying entire communities and that the state's refusal to use maximum force against them was a form of complicity. The early ultimatum marches achieved some success. Several drug dealers, faced with the public humiliation and implicit threat of community violence, announced they were leaving the drug trade. Some moved out of their neighborhoods, others made public statements renouncing their activities. These victories emboldened PAGAD and attracted new members. By mid-1996, the group could mobilize thousands of people for demonstrations. The marches became increasingly confrontational. What had started as peaceful protests with chanting and speeches evolved into tense standoffs, where the line between protest and mob violence became thin. As the state failed to respond, PAGAD became increasingly radicalized. By late 1996, moderate leaders had been sidelined, and a paramilitary wing called the G-Force had emerged. The G-Force operated in small, secretive cells and was trained in the use of weapons and explosives. Members used religious terms as operational codes. Azan, the Islamic call to prayer, signaled a pipe bomb attack. Thikr, a term for religious gatherings, referred to a planned assassination. The adoption of cell structures and coded communication indicated that PAGAD had studied insurgent and terrorist tactics. The G-force was not a spontaneous outgrowth of community anger. It was a deliberate organizational shift toward armed struggle. PAGAD had transformed from a popular social movement into a national security concern. The group was now using urban terrorism to achieve its objectives, and the state was struggling to respond. The transition from nonviolent protest to armed action occurred rapidly over a matter of months. Several factors contributed to this shift. First, the state's failure to arrest or prosecute major gang leaders convinced PAGAD members that legal channels were ineffective. Second, the continued violence on the Cape Flats created a sense of urgency and desperation. Third, the group's religious framing made violence not just permissible but righteous. If drug dealers were enemies of God, then killing them was an act of faith. Finally, the success of early ultimatum marches, which had driven some dealers out of their neighborhoods, suggested that direct action worked. The internal dynamics of PAGAD during this period reflected a power struggle between moderates and hardliners. The moderates, primarily older community leaders and religious figures, wanted to maintain pressure on the government through public demonstrations and political advocacy. They believed that sustained peaceful protest would eventually force the state to take action. The hardliners, often younger and more militant members, argued that peaceful protest had been tried and failed. They pointed to the continued gang violence as evidence that the state either could not or would not act. The hardliners gained influence partly because they were willing to take risks that moderates were not, and partly because the continued violence on the Cape Flats vindicated their analysis. On the evening of August 4, 1996, PAGAD organized a march to the home of the Staggy twins on London Road in Salt River. The march consisted of approximately 500 vehicles and several thousand people. The official purpose was to deliver an ultimatum demanding that the twins stop selling drugs, but the atmosphere was not one of peaceful protest. The crowd was angry and many members were armed. The size of the march was unprecedented. Previous ultimatum marches had involved dozens or perhaps a few hundred people. This was a mass mobilization. The decision to target the Staggy twins was strategic. They were the most high-profile gang leaders in Cape Town, and their organization was one of the largest and most violent. If PAGAD could confront the Staggies on their own turf, it would send a message to every other gang leader in the city. The planning for the march had been underway for weeks. PAGAD leaders had discussed whether to target Rashid or Rashad or both. Intelligence suggested that Rashad was more likely to be at the London Roadhouse, as he handled business operations from there, while Rashid was often traveling or managing operations in other parts of the city. The march was scheduled for early evening, a time when both the twins and PAGAD's supporters would be available. The route was planned to maximize visibility, passing through several neighborhoods where PAGAD had strong support before converging on Salt River. Rashad Staggie was generally considered the more peaceable of the two brothers. He handled the business side of the hard livings operation and was less involved in day-to-day violence than his twin Rashid. This perception may have contributed to his decision to confront the crowd. Rashad believed that his role as the businessman gave him a degree of protection, that his reputation would be sufficient to disperse the marchers. On the night of August 4, Rashad arrived at his home in an SUV as the crowd was gathering. Eyewitnesses reported that he jumped out of the vehicle and began mocking the assembled marchers. He called them cowards and told them to go home. His brother Rashid had reportedly warned him not to go home that night, but Rashad believed his reputation would protect him. He was wrong. The moment Rashad stepped out of his vehicle, the tension escalated. Some in the crowd began shouting at him. Others pushed forward. The police officers present attempted to form a barrier between Rashad and the crowd, but they were vastly outnumbered. Rashad stood his ground, apparently convinced that the marchers would not dare to attack him directly. For several minutes there was a standoff. Rashad hurled insults at the crowd. PAGAD members shouted back. The television cameras recorded everything. As Rashad stood in front of his house, a scuffle broke out. The exact sequence of events is disputed, with different witnesses providing conflicting accounts. Some say Rashad pulled a gun and fired at the crowd, others say he was unarmed. What is clear is that in the darkness, someone in the crowd fired a gun. Rashad was hit and collapsed into the gutter. The shooting triggered chaos. The crowd surged forward and several people rushed toward Rashad's body. What followed was recorded by multiple television crews and photographers who had followed the march. As Rashad lay wounded, someone threw a petrol bomb at his body. The bomb ignited and Rashad was engulfed in flames. In a sequence that would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world, he briefly stood up, arms flailing, and attempted to walk before collapsing onto the tarred road. The image of Rashad Staggie standing while on fire became one of the defining images of post-apartheid South Africa. It was visceral, horrifying, and deeply symbolic. Several police officers were present and attempted to douse the fire, but masked men in the crowd fired additional shots into Rashad's body, ensuring his death. The police were overwhelmed and unable to control the situation. Their presence had no deterrent effect. The crowd had moved beyond the point where state authority mattered. The images of Rashad Staggie burning on the street became one of the most infamous moments in South African history. This was not merely a killing. It was a televised lynching that signaled a total breakdown in the state's monopoly on legitimate force. Lynching, as a form of extrajudicial violence, has a long history in South Africa and globally. It represents the assertion of community justice against individuals perceived to have violated social norms. In the United States, lynching was used to terrorize black communities and enforce racial hierarchies. In South Africa, during the anti-apartheid struggle, suspected collaborators were sometimes killed through necklacing, a form of lynching involving a burning tire placed around the victim's neck. The killing of Rashad Staggie echoed these historical precedents. It was community violence enacted in public, designed to send a message not just to the victim but to everyone watching. The fact that Rashad died in front of his own house added another layer of symbolism. The home is supposed to be a place of safety, a sanctuary from external threats. For gang leaders, the home was also a symbol of power and status. Expensive houses in relatively upscale neighborhoods demonstrated that crime paid. By killing Rashad at his doorstep, PAGAD violated that sanctuary and undermined that symbolism. The message was clear. No place was safe for drug dealers. No amount of wealth or reputation could protect them. The killing of Rashad Staggie transformed PAGAD from a local community organization into a national security threat. The images of his death forced the state to acknowledge that it was no longer in control of the Cape Flats. The press coverage was extensive and controversial. News outlets around the world ran footage of Staggie burning. The images were graphic and disturbing, raising questions about journalistic ethics and the public's right to know versus the potential for such images to incite further violence. Benny Gould, the photojournalist who captured some of the most iconic images, had to go into hiding afterward out of fear of reprisal from both PAGAD and the gangs. His photographs won awards but also made him a target. The ethical debate around publishing the images was intense. Some argued that the graphic nature of the footage was essential to conveying the horror of what had occurred and the breakdown of law and order. Others argued that broadcasting such images glorified violence and could inspire copycat actions. News editors made different choices. Some outlets showed the full sequence, including Rashad standing while on fire. Others edited the footage to remove the most graphic moments. Still others refused to air the footage at all, describing the events in words instead. The debate reflected broader questions about the media's role in covering political violence and the responsibility of journalists to balance truth-telling with potential harm. For PAGAD, the event was a public relations success in the short term. It demonstrated the group's power and willingness to act where the state would not. The killing showed that no gang leader, regardless of reputation or connections, was beyond reach. In the days following the lynching, several drug dealers on the Cape Flats fled their homes or renounced their activities publicly. PAGAD had achieved through violence what years of police work had not. The group's membership swelled as people who had been skeptical of their methods now saw them as effective. Donations increased. Attendance at demonstrations grew. For a brief period, PAGAD appeared to be winning. For gang leaders across the Cape Flats, it was a message that their perceived untouchability was an illusion. The Staggie twins had been among the most powerful figures in the underworld, yet Rashad had been killed in front of his own house by a crowd of civilians. If the Staggies were vulnerable, everyone was. Some gang leaders responded by increasing their security. Others went into hiding. A few attempted to negotiate truces with PAGAD, offering to reduce their visibility or move their operations elsewhere. The immediate effect was a reduction in open drug dealing in some neighborhoods as dealers became more cautious. For the state, it was an act of vigilantism that threatened the foundations of the new constitutional democracy. South Africa had just emerged from decades of apartheid, a system built on the violent assertion of state power over black and colored communities. The new government was committed to the rule of law and to establishing a legitimate monopoly on force. PAGAD's actions challenged that monopoly directly. If communities could organize their own armed responses to crime, what was the purpose of the police? If extrajudicial killings were tolerated, what was the purpose of the courts? The Staggie lynching raised fundamental questions about the nature of justice in the new South Africa. President Nelson Mandela, who had championed reconciliation and the rule of law, was forced to address the incident. In public statements, he condemned the killing and warned against vigilantism. He argued that South Africa had fought too hard for democracy to allow it to be undermined by mob violence. But his words had limited impact on the Cape Flats, where many residents believed that the government had abandoned them to the gangs. The gap between Mandela's vision of a constitutional democracy and the reality of life in gang-controlled townships was stark. In the aftermath of the lynching, the government moved to criminalize PAGAD. Safety and Security Minister Steve Tshwete and Justice Minister Penel Magina began linking the group to global Islamic fundamentalism and organizations like Qibla. Qibla was a Cape Town-based Islamic organization with a history of political activism. During the anti-apartheid struggle, Qibla had supported armed resistance and had ties to international Islamic movements, including connections to Iran. By associating PAGAD with Qibla, government officials hoped to reframe the group as extremists rather than community activists. The strategy worked to some extent, particularly with international audiences and with non-Muslim South Africans who were already suspicious of political Islam. This strategy of demonization by association succeeded in transforming PAGAD from a popular mass movement into a smaller, better organized, but religiously radicalized and isolated group. The moderate members, those who had joined PAGAD out of frustration with gang violence rather than religious conviction, began to drift away. They were uncomfortable with the increasingly militant rhetoric and the violent tactics. The group that remained was more ideologically committed, more willing to use violence, and more insulated from mainstream South African society. This made PAGAD easier for the government to condemn, but also more dangerous and harder to dismantle. The state's response was complicated by the fact that many members of the new South African police service were former liberation fighters who were still adjusting to the strictures of a human rights-based constitution. During the apartheid era and the liberation struggle, violence had been a legitimate tool of resistance. Many police officers had been members of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the African National Congress or similar organizations. They had been trained to fight the state, not to uphold its laws through peaceful means. The transition to a democratic police force required a fundamental reorientation. Officers could no longer use the interrogation methods that had been standard during the apartheid era. They could no longer operate outside the law. This adjustment was difficult, and many officers sympathized with PAGAD's frustration, even if they could not publicly support the group's methods. Some police officers privately admitted that they understood why PAGAD had formed. They worked in the same neighborhoods, saw the same violence, and dealt with the same gang leaders. They knew which officers were corrupt and which gang leaders had protection. The difference was that police officers were constrained by rules and procedures that PAGAD ignored. This created a strange dynamic where police officers were tasked with stopping PAGAD while also understanding, and in some cases agreeing with, PAGAD's goals if not their methods. The sophisticated cell structure of PAGAD's G-Force made it difficult for informants to infiltrate the organization. The G-Force learned from the mistakes of other resistance movements. Members operated in small cells that did not know the identities of members in other cells. Communication was limited and coded. Meetings were rare and held in secure locations. This structure made it nearly impossible for police to identify leaders or prevent attacks. Even when individual members were arrested, they could provide only limited information about the broader organization. By the late 1990s, PAGAD was suspected of being behind a string of bombings targeting suspected gangsters, synagogues, gay nightclubs, and tourist attractions. The most prominent attack was the 1998 bombing of the Planet Hollywood restaurant at the V&A waterfront, which killed 2 people and injured 24. The Planet Hollywood bombing marked a turning point. Previous PAGAD attacks had targeted gang leaders or drug dealers, individuals who could plausibly be described as enemies of the community. The Planet Hollywood bombing targeted a civilian location frequented by tourists. The restaurant was a symbol of American cultural imperialism, but the victims were ordinary people who had nothing to do with gangs or drugs. The attack demonstrated that PAGAD had moved beyond its original mandate. The group was no longer fighting gangs. It was waging a broader campaign against perceived moral corruption, using tactics indistinguishable from terrorism. Subsequent attacks on synagogues suggested an anti-Semitic dimension that had not been apparent in PAGAD's early rhetoric. The bombings targeted Jewish religious sites, causing property damage but fortunately no deaths. The motivation for these attacks was never clearly articulated by PAGAD, but analysts suggested several possibilities. Some saw it as part of a broader anti-Western, anti-Zionist ideology that had crept into the organization's thinking. Others suggested it was an attempt to create broader chaos that would destabilize the government. Still, others thought it was the work of a splinter faction within PAGAD that had moved beyond the group's original leadership and was pursuing its own agenda. Attacks on gay nightclubs indicated homophobia that was consistent with certain interpretations of Islamic law, but was also deeply troubling to civil rights advocates. The new South African constitution explicitly protected sexual orientation, making South Africa one of the first countries in the world to do so. PAGAD's attacks on gay venues were not just criminal acts, but attacks on the constitutional order itself. They suggested that PAGAD had moved from fighting drugs and gangs to enforcing a particular moral code through violence. PAGAD was no longer a community defense organization. It had become a threat to civil society. The transformation was rapid and disturbing. In less than 3 years, PAGAD had evolved from a group of concerned parents and community leaders into a terrorist organization capable of sophisticated bombings. The trajectory illustrated how quickly community movements can radicalize when faced with state failure and when framed in absolutist religious terms. The death of Rashad Staggie did not dismantle the hard livings. If anything, it consolidated the power of his twin, Rashid. Famously, Rashid stated, "They killed the wrong brother," suggesting that he was far more dangerous and less inclined toward peaceable business dealings than Rashad. Rashid's nickname was Mad Dog, and he was rumored to be the more violent of the two. The perception within the gang and the wider community was that Rashad had been the moderating influence, the one who understood negotiation and long-term planning. Rashid was seen as impulsive, brutal, and driven by emotion rather than calculation. Whether this perception was accurate or a construct of gang mythology is unclear, but it shaped events after August 1996. In the immediate aftermath of his brother's death, Rashid went into hiding. There were credible threats against his life from both PAGAD and rival gangs who saw an opportunity to strike while the hard livings were vulnerable. For several months, Rashid moved between safe houses, avoiding public appearances and communicating with gang members through intermediaries. During this period, the hard livings experienced internal tensions. Some members wanted immediate retaliation against PAGAD. Others argued for a strategic retreat, reducing the gang's visibility until the heat died down. Rashid ultimately sided with the latter group, recognizing that an all-out war with PAGAD would be costly and might not be winnable. Following the 1996 incident, Rashid cultivated a complex public persona. He claimed to have given up gangsterism and drug dealing. He publicly converted to Christianity and moved to Durban for a period. The conversion was announced in local newspapers and involved a public baptism ceremony. Rashid gave interviews describing his transformation, speaking about finding God and wanting to leave his criminal past behind. He began touring schools, telling children, "I am a nothing and a scum." This language of redemption was strategic. Rashid understood that maintaining power required flexibility. By presenting himself as reformed, he reduced police attention and gained access to spaces and audiences that would have been closed to an active gang leader. His school visits were covered by local media, and he became a minor celebrity as a cautionary tale. Former gang leader turned motivational speaker. He would tell stories about his life in the hard livings, describing the violence and addiction without explicitly admitting to specific crimes. He would warn young people about the dangers of gang life and drug use. The performances were effective because they contained enough truth to be credible while omitting details that could be used against him in court. This language of redemption, describing himself as nothing and scum, might seem like humility, but it was actually a form of manipulation. By framing himself as broken and repentant, Rashid positioned himself as someone who had seen the light and could guide others away from the path he had taken. It was effective rhetoric because it acknowledged his past without fully accounting for it. He did not offer restitution to his victims or provide information to police about unsolved crimes. He simply declared himself reformed and expected society to accept that declaration. Many people did, at least publicly. While Rashid projected an image of reform, he remained deeply active in the Cape Town underworld. His goal, according to multiple sources, was to gain control of the entire city. The death of his brother had eliminated a rival for leadership within the hard livings, even though they had been partners. Now Rashid had sole authority. He used this authority to expand the gang's operations, forge new alliances, and eliminate competitors. His public persona as a reformed Christian provided cover for these activities. Who would suspect a man giving motivational speeches at schools of running a criminal empire? Police intelligence reports from this period, some of which were later leaked to the press, indicated that Rashid was actively involved in drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and ordering hits on rivals. He maintained his position as leader of the hard livings and was expanding the gang's operations into new territories. The disconnect between his public image and his actual activities was stark, but difficult to prove in court. Rashid was careful to insulate himself from direct involvement in crimes. He gave orders but rarely participated in their execution. He handled money through intermediaries. He avoided situations where he could be caught with drugs or weapons. Rashid's double life was eventually exposed by his own brutality. In 2003, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for kidnapping and ordering the gang rape of a 17-year-old girl. The victim had been a police informant who revealed where the hard livings stored their firearms. The firearms were seized in a raid that represented a significant loss for the gang. Weapons are expensive and difficult to replace, especially given South Africa's relatively strict gun laws. The loss of an arsenal worth hundreds of thousands of rands was a major blow. Rashid ordered the girl raped at gunpoint as a form of street justice. The crime was not spontaneous. It was premeditated and carried out by gang members acting on direct orders from Rashid. The rape was intended to send a message to other potential informants about the consequences of betrayal. The girl was abducted from her home, taken to a house controlled by the hard livings, and assaulted over several hours. She was then released with explicit warnings that she would be killed if she reported the crime. She did report it, and her courage in coming forward despite the very real danger she faced made the conviction possible. The conviction was considered a major victory for the Western Cape justice system. Gang leaders rarely faced serious consequences for their actions. Witnesses were intimidated or killed. Evidence disappeared. Police investigations stalled. The successful prosecution of Rashad Staggie represented a breakthrough. It demonstrated that even powerful gang leaders could be held accountable if witnesses were willing to testify and if the justice system provided adequate protection. During the trial, the victim's testimony was given in camera via closed-circuit television to protect her from the gang's reach. Gang members were believed to be searching hospital wards and family homes to eliminate the witness. The level of security required to protect her indicated the extent of the threat. She was moved multiple times during the trial, given a new identity, and provided with ongoing protection. Despite these measures, the victim lived in fear throughout the trial and afterward. Her willingness to testify, knowing the risks, was remarkable and deserves recognition. In 2004, Rashid was also convicted of stealing firearms from the Fora police armory, for which he received an additional 13-year sentence. The theft occurred in the late 1990s and involved an insider within the police force. A police officer whose name was never publicly released provided access to the armory in exchange for payment. The stolen weapons included rifles, pistols, and ammunition, which were distributed among Hard Living's members. The theft demonstrated both the gang's reach and the level of corruption within the police. An armory should have been one of the most secure locations in the province, yet gang members were able to enter and remove weapons without detection. The sentences were served concurrently, meaning his effective sentence was 15 years. He was released on day parole in 2013 for good behavior. The decision to grant parole to Rashad Staggie was controversial. Victims' rights groups argued that he remained a danger to society. Community leaders on the Cape Flats expressed concern that his release would embolden the Hard Livings. Police officials worried that he would immediately resume his leadership role within the gang. The Department of Correctional Services defended the decision by pointing to Rashid's participation in rehabilitation programs and his clean disciplinary record while incarcerated. The decision illustrated the tension between punishment and rehabilitation in the South African criminal justice system. The law required that prisoners be considered for parole if they had served a certain portion of their sentence and demonstrated good behavior. But good behavior in prison did not necessarily predict behavior outside. Rashid had been a model prisoner by institutional standards. He followed rules, attended programs, and avoided disciplinary infractions. But this revealed nothing about his intentions upon release or his continued connections to the Hard Livings. The aftermath of Rashad Staggie's lynching also saw a prolonged legal battle against PAGAD's leadership. It was not until 2000 that the men accused of his murder were brought to trial. The 4-year delay was partly due to the difficulty of identifying suspects. The killing occurred in a crowd of thousands, many of whom were masked. Witnesses were reluctant to come forward, either out of fear of PAGAD retaliation or sympathy with the group's goals. The police investigation was hampered by a lack of physical evidence and conflicting witness statements. PAGAD National Coordinator Abdusalam Ebrahim and 3 associates were eventually charged with murder. Ebrahim was the public face of PAGAD, a charismatic speaker who could mobilize crowds and articulate the group's grievances. Trial became a focal point for debates about vigilantism, justice, and the rule of law in post-apartheid South Africa. The prosecution argued that Ebrahim and his co-defendants had organized the march with the intention of killing Rashad Staggie, that the march was not a peaceful protest but a premeditated assassination disguised as community activism. They presented evidence of planning meetings, communications between PAGAD members, and the presence of weapons and petrol bombs in the crowd. The defense argued that while their clients had organized a protest march, they had not intended for anyone to be killed, that the violence had been spontaneous, and that they could not be held responsible for the actions of individuals in a crowd of thousands. In 2002, they were acquitted of murder but found guilty of public violence. The judge ruled that while the defendants had participated in the march and contributed to the atmosphere of violence, the prosecution had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that they had personally killed Rashad Staggie or had specifically conspired to kill him. The distinction between organizing a violent event and committing violence at that event became the central legal issue. The judge's reasoning was that criminal responsibility requires a direct causal link between an individual's actions and the crime. Organizing a march, even a volatile one, does not automatically make organizers responsible for every act committed by participants. The conviction for public violence carried a much lighter sentence than murder. Ebrahim and his co-defendants received prison terms of several years, and some were released on time served while awaiting trial. The sentences were widely seen as inadequate by those who viewed PAGAD as a terrorist organization and by Rashad Staggie's family. But they were also seen as unjust by PAGAD supporters who viewed the defendants as community heroes who had been scapegoated by a government that refused to deal with gang violence. The failure to secure a murder conviction was symptomatic of the state's struggle to manage urban terrorism and vigilantism. While 42 PAGAD members were convicted on various charges of urban violence by the late 1990s, not a single person was convicted of the actual bombings that rocked Cape Town between 1998 and 2000. The bombings included the Planet Hollywood attack, bombings of police stations, bombings of suspected drug dealers' homes, and bombings of civilian targets. In each case, the G-Force's cell structure protected the operatives. Bombmakers were not connected to those who placed the devices. Those who provided intelligence were not connected to those who carried out attacks. The few PAGAD members who were arrested either refused to cooperate or genuinely did not know enough to compromise the broader organization. The bombings eventually stopped, not because PAGAD was dismantled, but because the leadership apparently decided that the campaign had become counterproductive. The group had achieved its initial goal of reducing visible drug dealing in some neighborhoods, but had lost public support due to its increasingly indiscriminate violence. By 2001, PAGAD's bombing campaign had largely ended, though the organization continued to exist in a reduced form. The police were caught in what one analyst described as a bizarre historical bind. The new South African police service was supposed to operate within constitutional constraints. Officers could not torture suspects or detain them indefinitely without charge. They could not raid homes without warrants or surveil citizens without judicial oversight. These protections were essential to the democratic transition, but they also made certain types of investigations more difficult. The apartheid-era security forces had operated with impunity, using brutal methods to extract information and intimidate opponents. Those methods were effective in the short term but morally indefensible and ultimately counterproductive. The new police force was committed to respecting human rights, even when investigating violent criminals. The sophisticated cell structure of PAGAD's G-Force made it nearly impossible for informants to penetrate the organization. Traditional policing relies heavily on informants, individuals within criminal organizations who provide information to law enforcement in exchange for money, reduced sentences, or other benefits. But informants are only useful if they have access to valuable information. PAGAD's structure ensured that most members knew only their immediate cell and had no knowledge of the broader organization. An informant might be able to provide information about a single planned attack, but not about the leadership, funding, or long-term strategy of the group. This made it extremely difficult for police to dismantle PAGAD systematically. The state's response eventually involved the creation of the Scorpions, a specialized investigative unit designed to tackle organized crime and urban terror. The Scorpions were established in 1999 as part of the National Prosecuting Authority. Unlike traditional police units, the Scorpions combined investigation and prosecution, allowing for more coordinated and strategic approaches to complex cases. The unit was given resources and legal powers that ordinary police did not have. It could investigate across provincial boundaries, conduct sophisticated surveillance, and bring cases directly to specialized courts. The Scorpions achieved some success against organized crime and corruption, including cases involving high-profile politicians and businesspeople. The unit's work on PAGAD was less successful, partly because by the time the Scorpions were fully operational, PAGAD's most active phase had ended. But the Scorpions did contribute to a broader climate where organized criminal groups faced more sophisticated and persistent investigation. The unit was eventually disbanded in 2009 for political reasons, a decision that many analysts believe weakened South Africa's capacity to fight organized crime. But by the time the Scorpions were operational, the damage to the community's trust in the formal justice system had already been done. The belief that if we don't punish them, who will, had become widespread among both police and civilians. This belief reflected a fundamental crisis of legitimacy. A state's authority rests on its ability to protect citizens and deliver justice. When citizens believe the state cannot or will not do these things, they look for alternatives. PAGAD represented one such alternative. Vigilantism, extrajudicial killings, and community violence became normalized because the formal system had failed to provide acceptable outcomes. The long-term impact of the PAGAD episode on South African society is still debated. Some argue that PAGAD permanently damaged the rule of law by demonstrating that mob violence could achieve outcomes that legal processes could not. Others argue that PAGAD forced necessary conversations about crime, justice, and state capacity. What is clear is that the Cape Flats never returned to the status quo that existed before 1996. Gang violence continued, but so did community organizing. The relationship between communities and gangs, and between communities and the state, had been fundamentally altered. The era of the old-school Cape Flats gang bosses effectively ended on December 13, 2019. Rashad Staggie, then 58 years old, was sitting in a friend's Toyota Corolla sedan outside his home on London Road in Salt River. This was the same street where his brother had been lynched 23 years earlier. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Rashid had returned to the exact location where his twin had died, the place that represented both the pinnacle and the vulnerability of gang power. Two assailants approached the vehicle and fired a hail of bullets into the sedan. Rashid was riddled with bullets and was confirmed dead on arrival at Groot Schuer Hospital. The attack was quick and professional, suggesting either experienced killers or individuals with military or police training. The timing and location of the assassination were highly symbolic. His death occurred just one day after the shooting of another Hard Living's leader, Balliet Tips, in Mitchell's Plain. The proximity of the two killings suggested coordination, a broader operation targeting Hard Living's leadership. Despite expectations of a citywide gang war, the assassination of the last original gang boss brought what one analyst described as a fleeting order to the gang landscape. There was no immediate retaliation, no tit-for-tat killings. No public statements from Hard Living's members vowing revenge. The silence was notable and required explanation. The lack of retaliation suggested several possibilities. First, the Hard Livings may have been too fractured to mount an effective response. Without Rashid's centralizing leadership, different factions within the gang may have been unable to agree on a course of action. Second, the killers may have had sufficient backing that retaliation would have been too costly. If the assassination was ordered by a coalition of rival gangs, or had the tacit approval of powerful figures within the prison system, the Hard Livings may have calculated that revenge was not worth the risk. Third, Rashid may have been so unpopular even within his own organization that his death was welcomed rather than mourned. The assassination of Rashad Staggie has been attributed to several overlapping factors. One theory suggests that a relative within the Hard Livings, frustrated by being denied a promotion within the gang's hierarchy, plotted the hit with a rival gang. Gang promotions are serious matters. They determine status, income, and access to resources. A passed-over member might feel not just disappointed but humiliated and betrayed. In a culture where respect is paramount, such a slight could justify extreme action. The theory suggests that this individual approached a rival gang, possibly the Americans or another organization, and offered intelligence about Rashid's movements and security arrangements in exchange for assistance with the killing. Another theory points to Rashid's deteriorating relationship with the 28's prison gang. The alliance between the Hard Livings and the 28's had been mutually beneficial for decades, but alliances in the underworld are only as strong as their continued usefulness. By 2019, Rashid was in his late 50s and no longer the dominant force he had been. Younger leaders within the Hard Livings were positioning themselves for succession. The 28's may have calculated that Rashid was no longer worth supporting and that a new leader might offer better terms. The loss of 28's backing would have left Rashid vulnerable, as it would have signaled to other gangs that he no longer had powerful allies. The prison gang system in South Africa exercises enormous influence over street gangs. Decisions made inside correctional facilities ripple outward into neighborhoods across the Western Cape. If the 28's leadership decided that Rashid had outlived his usefulness, that decision would have been communicated through the prison network to street operatives. Such a signal would have made Rashid a legitimate target in the eyes of the underworld, removing the protection that had kept him alive for decades. A third theory involves allegations that Rashid had defrauded Nigerian investors looking to enter the Cape Town drug market. Nigerian criminal networks have become increasingly active in South Africa over the past 2 decades, particularly in the drug trade. These networks operate internationally and have significant financial resources. They bring expertise in synthetic drug production, international smuggling routes, and money laundering. For local gangs like the Hard Livings, partnerships with Nigerian networks could be extremely lucrative but also dangerous. If Rashid had taken money from Nigerian investors with the promise of facilitating their entry into the Cape Town market and then failed to deliver, he would have made dangerous enemies. The allegations suggest that Rashid accepted payment, perhaps hundreds of thousands or even millions of rands, to provide protection and market access for Nigerian drug operations. But instead of delivering on his promises, he either kept the money and did nothing, or was unable to fulfill his commitments due to police pressure or resistance from other gangs. Nigerian networks have a reputation for ruthless enforcement of debts and contracts. A fraud of this nature would likely result in swift and violent retaliation. The international nature of these networks means they have access to professional killers and the resources to carry out sophisticated hits. Crucially, both the gang underworld and the community appeared to welcome the outcome. Rashid's double life, claiming to be a Christian convert while remaining active in criminal markets, had violated the unwritten rules of the underworld. In gang culture, one can only leave the life through what is called the porthole to God, meaning a genuine and total religious conversion. This is not just about personal belief. It is about completely severing ties with the criminal organization, renouncing all benefits derived from criminal activity, and accepting whatever consequences follow. The concept is rooted in an understanding that gang membership is not merely economic or social but spiritual. Leaving requires a transformation so complete that returning becomes unthinkable. Rashid's perceived inauthenticity, claiming conversion while continuing to operate, made his death, in the eyes of both his allies and rivals, inevitable. He had tried to have it both ways, maintaining his position within the hard livings while presenting himself publicly as a reformed Christian. This duplicity was seen as a fundamental betrayal of the code. It suggested that Rashid viewed religion as a tool for manipulation rather than a genuine path to redemption. In a culture where authenticity and respect are paramount, this was an unforgivable transgression. The story of the Staggy twins and the PAGAD response illustrates the concept of powerlessness as deeply relational to economic, psychosocial, and spiritual dimensions. In the post-apartheid era, colored communities on the Cape Flats remained socioeconomically vulnerable. The end of apartheid did not automatically translate into economic opportunity or social mobility. Unemployment remained high, schools remained underfunded, and infrastructure remained inadequate. The spatial segregation of the apartheid era persisted even after its legal structures were dismantled. The Cape Flats remained a dumping ground, physically and economically separated from the wealth and opportunity concentrated in Cape Town's city center and suburbs. The post-apartheid government faced enormous challenges in addressing these structural inequalities. Resources were limited. The economy was struggling. The bureaucracy inherited from the apartheid era was ill-suited to delivering services to previously marginalized communities. Political will was present at the highest levels, but implementation was difficult. The result was that conditions on the Cape Flats improved only marginally, if at all, in the decades following 1994. For many residents, democracy had changed who held political power but had not changed their daily lives. Gangs utilized coercive power through violence and economic power by providing status and financial aid to maintain control. Coercive power is straightforward. It is the ability to inflict harm on those who resist or disobey. Gangs demonstrated this power regularly through beatings, shootings, and other forms of violence. The threat of violence was often sufficient. Residents knew what happened to those who defied the gangs, so most chose compliance. Economic power is more subtle but equally effective. It is the ability to provide resources that people need to survive or improve their circumstances. When the state fails to provide employment, education, or social services, gangs can step into that vacuum. They become employers, lenders, and welfare providers. This dual power base, violence combined with economic assistance, creates a system of control that is difficult to escape. PAGAD's emergence was a quest for spiritual and social power by a community that felt betrayed by the state. Spiritual power in this context refers to the moral authority to define right and wrong and to act on those definitions. Social power refers to the ability to mobilize collective action and enforce community norms. PAGAD claimed both forms of power. They asserted that drug dealers were morally wrong and that the community had the right to stop them. They demonstrated social power by organizing thousands of people to march through the streets and confront gang leaders. The religious framing of their struggle provided legitimacy and motivation that secular approaches had lacked. The ritualistic nature of Rashad Staggie's death, the burning, the television cameras, the public square, was a bid to reclaim the fear that gangsters had historically used to dominate the community. Fear is a form of power. Gangs maintained control partly through the community's fear of retaliation. By killing Rashad Staggie in public in front of cameras, PAGAD reversed that dynamic. They demonstrated that they were not afraid and that gang leaders should fear them. The spectacle was intended to shift the psychological balance of power. However, as PAGAD adopted the very criminal tactics they initially fought, they became indistinguishable from the threat they sought to eradicate. The bombings, the assassinations, the coded language and cell structures, these were the methods of terrorists, not community activists. PAGAD had become what it set out to destroy. This transformation illustrates a common pattern in vigilante movements. They begin with legitimate grievances and community support. But as they escalate their tactics and become more isolated from mainstream society, they lose their moral authority and become simply another source of violence. The persistence of the deprivation trap on the Cape Flats continues to provide a breeding ground for gang growth. By 2014, Western Cape gangs were believed to account for nearly 70% of all crime in the province, with membership estimated between 80,000 and 100,000 people. These numbers indicate that gangs are not marginal. They are central to the social and economic structure of the Cape Flats. Tens of thousands of people derive their income, directly or indirectly, from gang activity. Tens of thousands more are affected by gang violence, either as victims or as residents of neighborhoods where gangs operate. The Hard Livings remain one of the most organized and centralized gangs, despite the loss of their founding brothers. The organization has adapted to the deaths of Rashad and Rashid by developing a more distributed leadership structure. Rather than relying on a single charismatic leader, the gang now operates through a council of senior members who make collective decisions. This structure is more resilient to targeted assassinations or arrests, but also less decisive and more prone to internal conflict. The current hard livings is less visible than during the Staggy era, but remains deeply embedded in the Cape Flats economy. The transition from the Staggy era to the present day reflects a shift from territorial street gangs led by charismatic original gang bosses to highly sophisticated transnational criminal syndicates that are less visible but more deeply embedded in the global illicit economy. The original gang bosses, figures like Rashid and Rashad Staggie, were local celebrities. They were visible, accessible, and in some cases even admired. The current generation of gang leaders operates differently. They maintain lower profiles, avoid media attention, and use intermediaries to insulate themselves from law enforcement. They are less interested in local dominance for its own sake and more focused on maximizing profits through integration into international criminal networks. This evolution makes gangs harder to combat because the leadership is less exposed and the operations are more complex. The deaths of Rashad and Rashid Staggie on London Road remain a testament to the cycle of violence where gang power, regardless of its reach, ultimately leads to a death sentence on your own doorstep. Both brothers died within meters of their home, the place that should have represented safety and sanctuary. The location underscores the central irony of gang power. No amount of wealth, violence, or reputation can provide true security when you have made enemies of an entire community or betrayed the code that governs the underworld. The failure of the state to provide basic social and economic security on the Cape Flats allowed the hard livings to become an integral part of the social fabric. Gangs filled the void left by government neglect. They provided structure, income, and identity in an environment where legitimate avenues to these things were scarce or non-existent. While the flamboyant leadership of the Staggies is gone, the structural conditions that created them, poverty, spatial exclusion, and the power to pay remain. Nothing fundamental has changed on the Cape Flats. Schools are still overcrowded. Unemployment is still high. Police are still under-resourced or corrupt. Young men still face an abyss of danger with few clear paths to legitimate success. In this environment, gangs remain rational actors, providing opportunities that the formal economy does not. The cycle will continue until the underlying conditions change, and there is little indication that the political will exist to make those changes. London Road stands as a symbol of the shadow city, where justice is often swift, public, and devastatingly final. The street has witnessed two high-profile killings 23 years apart, both involving the same family, both broadcast to the world. It represents the intersection of gang power and community vengeance, of state failure and vigilante justice. The fact that both brothers died on the same street in front of the same house adds a layer of tragic symmetry to their story. It suggests that certain fates are inescapable, that the choices made decades earlier on the Cape Flats inevitably led to these specific outcomes. The legacy of the Staggy dynasty is not just one of blood and fire, but a warning of what happens when a community is forced to choose between the terror of the gang and the terror of the vigilante. When the state cannot or will not protect its citizens, they will find other means of protection. Those means are often violent, often illegal, and often reproduce the very problems they seek to solve. PAGAD's transformation from community activists to terrorists illustrates this dynamic. The hard living's evolution from street gang to international criminal syndicate illustrates another aspect of the same problem. In both cases, the absence of effective state governance created space for non-state actors to assert power, with devastating consequences for ordinary residents.